HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Journeys of Trees, a story about forests, people, and the future, by Zach St. George. Read by Daniel Henning. Introduction. In February 2004, Connie Barlow lay down under a small evergreen tree, stared up through its branches, and made it a promise. "I'm going to find a way," she told the tree. "I'm going to move you." Barlow, a retired science writer and working evolutionary evangelist, was in a state park overlooking the Apalachicola River, which cuts north to south across the Florida panhandle. The tree was a Torreya taxifolia, called variously in English Florida nutmeg, savin, gopherwood, and stinking cedar, the last for the offensive smell its foliage emits when crushed. Barlow, a partisan, thinks the nickname is what's offensive. She prefers to call the tree simply Florida Torreya. The tree is a conifer, with pin-sharp needles and fleshy fruit. From afar, the tree has the draped, disheveled form of an old shag rug and is of medium build, sometimes 50 or 60 feet tall, although it's hard to find one that tall today. It is rare, growing over only a couple dozen square miles in the steep ravines that cut through the limestone bluffs overlooking the Apalachicola River. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Florida Torreya was confined to its few square miles, but within these miles it was common. Locals used Torreyas for fence posts and firewood and Christmas trees, but in the 1950s, the Torreyas started dying. The culprit seemed to be a fungus. The trees died back to their roots, which then sent up suckers. These suckers would get to be 10 or 12 feet tall and a couple inches thick, and then they would succumb to the fungus too. What was the fungus? Why now? Nobody knew. Decades went by, and the tree grew rarer and rarer. Various people and universities and botanical gardens and state and federal agencies tried to save it, but none of them could wrest it from its terminal slide. Then, in the early 2000s, Connie Barlow visited Torreya State Park, found the suckers, and saw that the problem was a simple one. So simple, in fact, that it beggared belief that nobody had realized it and acted on it before. The problem wasn't the fungus at all. The tree's real problem was that it had gotten stuck. Individual trees, as will be apparent to most people who have encountered one, don't often move around. Once a tree is rooted in one spot, it's rare for it to wind up in another. Forests, though, are restless things. Any time a tree dies or sprouts, the forest it is a part of has shifted a little. The migration of a forest is just many trees sprouting in the same direction. Through the fossils that ancient forests leave behind, scientists can track their movements over the eons. They shuffle back and forth across continents, sometimes following the same route more than once, like migrating birds or whales. This Florida Torreya, Barlow thought, was not supposed to be a Florida Torreya at all. It should have been a northern Georgia Torreya, or a Virginia Torreya, or maybe even a Pennsylvania Torreya. It should have migrated north at the end of the Pleistocene, 11,700 years ago, but for some reason it had not. Now it was marooned in hot, sticky Florida, a place growing only hotter and stickier. The fungus was just a symptom of this mismatch, the way polar bears in zoos will sometimes grow algae on their fur and turn green. The Florida Torreya, she thought, was a tree in the wrong place. The solution to this problem was simple: move the tree north. In his 1908 book, Worlds in the Making, Swedish scientist Svante Arrhenius wrote that the enormous combustion of coal by our industrial establishments suffices to increase the percentage of carbon dioxide in the air to a perceptible degree. He predicted this would cause the planet to warm. He saw it as a welcome side effect. "We may hope to enjoy ages with more equable and better climates," he wrote. "Ages when the earth will bring forth much more abundant crops than at present, for the benefit of rapidly propagating mankind." By the 1980s, scientists thought Arrhenius was correct. Human population was warming the world, but it seemed likely to be less pleasant than the Swede had imagined. In a 1981 paper, a group of NASA scientists, led by atmospheric physicist James Hansen, predicted rising seas, growing deserts, and large-scale human dislocations. The rest of the world's living things would be rearranged too. Every species has certain climatic requirements, what degree of heat or cold it can tolerate, for example. When the climate changes, the places that satisfy those requirements change too. Species are forced to follow. All creatures are capable of some degree of movement, or dispersal, as scientists call it. A mobile creature, like a fish or a bird, might move around throughout its life, but even creatures that appear immobile, like trees and barnacles, are capable of dispersal at some stage of their life, as a seed in the case of the tree, or as a larva in the case of the barnacle. A creature must get from the place it is born, often occupied by its parents, to a place where it can survive, grow, and reproduce. Movement is constant and essential. From fossils, scientists knew that even creatures like trees had moved with surprising speed during past periods of climate change. But the climate now seemed to be changing much faster than ever before. By the early 1990s, a growing number of scientists had concluded that many species would not be able to keep up. They suggested the same solution that Connie Barlow later would: move the species to places where they would be better suited. People had spent millennia moving living things from one part of the world to another, farming and gardening and trying to improve their surroundings, all with little thought for the fate of the species involved. In one sense, then, helping slow species move faster or helping fast species avoid barriers would be only a small variation of this oft-repeated theme. But many more scientists, often the same scientists who suggested it, were wary of this solution. The species that people had moved from one part of the world to another had often caused problems both for people and for other species. They often turned into invaders. Scientists and conservationists had argued for decades that people should avoid moving species from one place to another. They should aim to keep the world's living things in roughly their current arrangement. Not static, but within some historic range of variation. The best way to help the world's living things cope with climate change, they said, would be to preserve wild places, to maintain or create corridors where species might migrate on their own, or, best of all, to stop the world from warming further. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, scientists treated the idea of moving species to save them from climate change as a subject for more discussion, as a possibility for another day. Barlow told me that for some forms of life, there was room for deliberation. "You've got time for perennials and salamanders and things you can just pick up and move," she said. But trees were slow. Creating a new forest demands a certain amount of foresight, a departure from the usual human schedule. Barlow saw her plan to move the Florida Toria north as a kind of optimism. Where others denied the depth of the problem, she accepted it. With acceptance came agency. She couldn't save the tree from the fungus. She couldn't keep the climate from changing. Really, there weren't many things she could do, but she could plant a tree. This is a book about trees, so it's worth noting here at the outset a point of linguistic sloppiness. The word tree is really only a description of geometry. Scientists still sometimes use a more exacting definition, but for our purposes the common one will do. A tree is a tall plant with a woody stem. In a way, a tree is just a logical conclusion. For an organism in the business of harvesting solar energy, it helps to have a platform higher than the neighbors. Tall, woodsy plants have evolved many times in Earth's history. The oldest known trees are preserved as fossils in upstate New York. They date to the Middle Devonian, some 387 million years ago. These pseudosporiocanalian trees seem to have looked something like enormous stalks of celery, long, fluted columns topped with bunches of finger-like photosynthetic appendages. The lycopsids were another group of ancient trees. Lycopsids today are club mosses, spike mosses, and quillworts, modest things, but the lycopsids of old grew 100 feet tall and made globe-spanning forests. Some of these trees looked like they were made of tarantula legs. Others looked like golf tees that grew a thick coat of hair. More familiar trees showed up in the Permian 299 million years ago. This was likely the earliest point in the planet's history when a time-traveling botanist could set their machine down on land and feel nearly at home. They might write to their friends in the future and say, "You will begin to think that I manufacture pines at my pleasure." Many of the trees they would have seen were conifers, ancestors of the trees that still cover much of the planet, the pines and larches, kauri and sequoias. The 600-some extant conifer species include the world's biggest, tallest, and oldest trees. Over the next 100 million years, more members of the modern ensemble made their way on stage. One was the cycad. Often confused with palm trees, cycads have palm-like fronds and bristled trunks. Today, they can frequently be found growing in corporate atriums. Another was the ginkgo, a tree with leaves like duck's feet, currently represented by a single species, Ginkgo biloba. Monks in China and Japan tended the tree for centuries, planting it outside temples. Indeed, wrote British biologist Colin Tudge, it is unclear whether any wild trees remain or whether all the surviving specimens were planted by people. Ginkgos are now popular as street trees everywhere they will grow. These three types of trees are all gymnosperms. They cast sex to the wind, releasing clouds of pollen from male cones in the hope that they will find corresponding female cones or ovules. Gymnosperms ruled the world for 150 million years before angiosperms appeared. Angiosperms had a different strategy. Many of them relied on other creatures to join pollen and egg. They made lures, colorful and sugary and aromatic, called flowers. Over the ages, flowering trees usurped the gymnosperms. Today, they far outnumber gymnosperms in their diversity of species, and they dominate forests across much of the world. It seems like an understatement to describe this grand competition as one between two simple categories of trees. As ecologist E.C. Pailu wrote, gymnosperms and angiosperms are deeply unalike. The differences between them are profound, she wrote, so profound that it is ludicrous nowadays to lump them collectively as trees. But she offered no substitutes. Tall and woody, then. Somewhere in that unparticular set of characteristics is something that particularly stirs us. Although a story of climactic mismatch could be told of any number of creatures, with a quillwort or a coral as star, for instance, it would bump endlessly into little hurdles of understanding. Trees are more familiar. They are everywhere, covering a third of the land on Earth. Forests are home to millions of species, so a story about trees says much about living things in general. And people like trees. They provide us fuel and building supplies, true, but the human arboreal connection goes beyond the merely practical. We seem to have a stronger affinity for trees than we do for grasses, which supply most of our food, or for algae, which supply most of the world's oxygen. Maybe it is instinct. Some have speculated that a scene with the right mix of trees and open land summons some deep nostalgia for the savanna of our species' youth. Or maybe it's just a weird type of narcissism. As historian Jared Farmer noted, trees are identifiable as individuals and often take a human-like shape, with limbs and a trunk. You can hug a tree. Try hugging a quillwort. A tree is also a ready symbol, embodying different qualities at different times in its life. A seed, for example, suggests hidden potential. See the mighty oak spring from the tiny acorn. A sapling that bends in the wind, meanwhile, demonstrates a flexibility that people would do well to emulate. A mature tree, most evocative of all, represents endurance. The most interesting ideas connected with trees are those suggested by their stability and duration, wrote botanist Asa Gray in the mid-1800s. They far outlast all other living things and form the familiar and appropriate symbols of long protracted existence. He continued, quoting from the book of Isaiah, "As the days of a tree shall be the days of my people," is one of the most beautiful and striking figures under which a blessing can be conveyed. Planting a tree, then, is a symbolic act. A tree might outlive the person who planted it by centuries or millennia, providing shade or beauty or raw materials to generations unborn. Hydroseed your yard, and nobody will thank you. But plant a tree, and you have extended a hand to the future. Finally, a word on your narrator. I am just a writer, not a scientist or a forester or an activist. I am knowledgeable about the natural world only to an average degree. If there is a story to how I came to tell this story, it is simply that some years ago I encountered the idea of trees being in the wrong places and thought that this was strange and fantastic and possibly important. It raised a series of questions about the present, past, and future arrangement of the world's living things. Once I started to think this way, it was hard to stop. I began to see trees in cities and parks and wonder where they'd come from and who planted them and why. I began to see dead trees and new seedlings out in the woods and wonder where the woods were headed. I began calling foresters and scientists and tree lovers of all makes to ask them unanswerable questions about the future. If you do this kind of thing long enough, it is inevitable that you will find your way to Connie Barlow. The first time we spoke on the phone, Barlow was in Albuquerque, New Mexico, staying with friends, which is something she does almost constantly. She and her husband, Michael Dowd, are wandering preachers. They travel the country in their Dodge Sprinter van, speaking at churches and other community centers. Dowd, a former pastor, preaches non-denominational sermons about the religious meaning to be found in acceptance of Darwin and Wallace's theory of evolution. Barlow gives talks on climate change and on cultivating what she calls a deep time perspective. During our phone conversations, Barlow speaks faster than I can type notes. She has a Michigander accent and is prone to loud bursts of laughter. Her emails are their own genre. They are pages long, dappled with phrases in boldface, italics, or block caps, each designed to draw attention to this or that important point. Her style as a correspondent tends to be imperative. She begins paragraphs with notice or note or see, and usually includes long reading assignments. I often wake up to a half-dozen new emails from Connie Barlow. By the time we first spoke, Barlow had been arguing about the true nature of the Florida Toria's problem for more than a decade. A volunteer group she had founded, Toria Guardians, had sent Toria seeds to Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, the District of Columbia, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, New Hampshire, and Vermont. The trees were growing all over the eastern United States. Despite the seeming success of her project, Barlow was frustrated. She had hoped, just as her critics had feared, that more people would be following her lead, shipping rare trees north en masse. Instead, the scientists she'd expected to come around to her view were still mired in debate. They often cited her project as a bad example. Few average citizens seemed to show much interest in either the problems facing forests or in climate change more generally, both surely interesting topics. Meanwhile, everywhere she looked were species in need of human help. What about the Brewer spruce? What about the Rocky Mountain bristlecone pine? Ah! She yelled into the phone. I just go crazy. But a person does what she can. At Sandia Peak, near Albuquerque, Barlow collected seeds from a grove of alligator juniper, another conifer that she thought needed help moving north. The tree's seeds are surrounded by a fleshy fruit. She guessed that they would be more likely to germinate after a trip through the bowels of a beast. The Sprinter van's next stop was almost 200 miles north, in the town of Chama, near New Mexico's border with Colorado. There are other alligator junipers at that latitude, but none in the immediate area. One afternoon, she ate the seeds she'd collected. Most juniper berries taste bad, she said, but the alligator juniper berry is nearly delicious. It's sweet, she said, doesn't have that resinous taste. Was what Barlow did next the right thing to have done? Was it helpful to the trees? Was it helpful to future humans or to other organisms? Was it harmful? Was it too little, too late, or too much, too soon? I can say, at least, that what she did was unusual. People move trees around all the time, but rarely with such intent, such determination, such dedication. The next morning, she told me, she'd gone for a long hike. At first she was vague, but I pressed her for details, just to make sure I'd understood. I had. Yes, she said, I am the woman who poops seeds. When I told her I didn't think many people would be willing to do that, she laughed and laughed. 1. They seem to be immortal. More than any other living thing, trees define their surroundings. They break up the horizon, mark the trail, soften hard edges. You can pick them out one by one, a single thread, or as a texture, the whole cloth. Entire scenes can be conjured by the presence or absence of trees, the forest, the field, the house on the corner with the maple in the yard. A tree is a rooted thing, so a tree is also a place. One fall morning, a few years back, I joined a group of U.S. Geological Survey scientists on a hike in Sequoia National Park. Set high in the Sierra Nevada of eastern California, the park was so named because it is a place where giant sequoias grow. Even by arboreal standards, members of species Sequoiadendron giganteum carry unusual geographic weight. They are the world's biggest trees, and among its oldest and tallest. All of the things people like about trees in general taken to an exaggerated end. Every year, millions of people travel from around the world to see them. They give the strong impression of permanence. I never saw a big tree that had died a natural death, John Muir wrote. Barring accidents, they seem to be immortal. But on the day of my visit, the trees seemed newly fragile. The first storm of the season had swept through the night before and left a skiff of snow that fluttered off the trees, sparkling in the light. I followed the field crew through the park's giant forest grove, past pines and firs, oaks and incense cedars. A sequoia is an unsubtle thing, but there, in the spare, open galleries of the park's forests, they had a way of appearing suddenly, as if you'd turned some invisible corner. "You see this really bad one?" said one of the field crew members, pointing up the trail at a tree that had just come into view. "Wow," said Nate Stevenson, looking up at it. "Wow." The tree's trunk was red-orange, wide as a school bus tipped on its end, free of branches for 100 feet. It looked carved from desert rock, eroded, furrowed, pocked with woodpecker holes, and squashed like a candle melted down over its stick. At its base, it opened into a deep fire hollow, what foresters call a cat-face scar, that angled closed as though the tree was zipped together from the top. The snow at its feet was carpeted with golden-brown leaves, each a curl of overlapping pointed scales. Stevenson, an ecologist, was the group's leader. He craned his neck to take in the tree's crown. Great clouds of foliage billowed from limbs that were themselves thick as trees. But where there should have been lush blue-green was more golden-brown. Maybe the tree had been girdled during the last fire, leaving it vulnerable, Stevenson said. It's probably going to die. It was October 2014, 3 years into a statewide drought. That summer, the sequoias had started losing their needles. Foliage turned brown and fell away in clumps. Stevenson hadn't seen anything like it in his 4 decades at the park. There were no records of anybody else seeing it before either. Reporters had been calling from around the world, asking if the sequoias were dying. Stevenson wasn't sure what to tell them. He was beginning to worry. Sequoias are rare. Giants lost in a sea of lesser trees that grow in just 70-odd groves scattered along a narrow sliver of the Sierra Nevada's western slopes, between 4,500 and 8,000 feet in elevation, from Lake Tahoe in the north to Deer Creek, 200 miles south. Rarity means vulnerability to small accidents, to a new disease, to a sudden change in conditions. Despite the durability of individual trees, the species has always seemed vulnerable. European Americans have been trying to save them for 150 years. They first learned of sequoias in the winter of 1853, when a man named Gus Dowd stumbled into a grove of the trees while chasing a grizzly he'd shot and wounded. Dowd was a hunter hired to supply meat to a crew of men digging a water ditch for a gold mine. He was known among his fellows as something of a storyteller, according to one of those fellows, a man named Keene, who recorded the event in his diary. "One evening old Dow told us he had found the largest tree in America," Keene wrote. The boys laughed at him, but he swore it was so. Keene also noted that the boys were sick of eating bear meat. For years, there had been rumors of giant trees growing high in the Sierra Nevada, but few people believed them. The local Native Americans, of course, had always known of the Wawona, the big trees, and might have dispelled some of the mystery had anyone bothered to ask. Dowd finally persuaded the crew's captain to accompany him back to the trees. Before long, the Calaveras Chronicle printed a story about Dowd's discovery, and wire services soon carried news of the species around the world. They called it the Sylvan Mastodon, the enormous vegetable production, the big cylinder. A few months later, a team of men traveled to the grove, carrying saws and axes. When they arrived, they found that their saws were too short and their axes too small, so they attacked the tree instead with pump augers, long hand-turned drills used to hollow out logs for water pipes. For 20 days, they drilled hole after hole through the tree, then spent 2 days driving in wedges. On the 23rd day, while the workers were away at lunch, or so the story goes, a gust of wind blew it over. After the tree fell, the men cut a 2-foot-thick slab from its midsection, which they carted first to Stockton, then to San Francisco, where they displayed it at the corner of Bush and Montgomery. They made some people angry. "We hope that no one will conceive the idea of purchasing Niagara Falls with the same purpose," the editor of one magazine complained. Said another, "From this beginning, unless the Goths and Vandals are arrested in their work, the destruction of the incomparable forest will probably go on till the last vestige of it is destroyed." At the time, this sort of protest was unusual. Tree hugging of any kind was rare. Millions of bison still roamed the United States. Chestnut trees still towered over Appalachia. Flocks of passenger pigeons still blotted out eastern skies. The first oil well had not yet been drilled. The West was still a frontier. It was possible to hunt for grizzlies in the mountains of California. Looking back, the world of the 1850s seems impossibly abundant. Why conserve when there was plenty? These sequoias, though, seemed worth saving. While more of the big trees were felled in the next decades for sideshows and timber, eventually people did save most of them. But it can be hard to know the right way to save something. Early conservationists thought the trees were threatened not only by the axe, but also by fire, so the sequoias' would-be saviors tried to protect them from that too. It was a mistake. Fire had always burned through the groves, low and slow. The trees needed it to clear away competitors and make space for their seedlings. Without it, the groves grew in thick, so that any fire now would be a big one, hot and fast, able to reach the sequoia's boughs and burn through their thick bark. People have worked since the 1960s to return fire to the groves, but many of them remain clotted without new seedlings. Even as scientists like Stevenson worked to fix
Sample complete. Ready to continue?